reframing has this inherent kind of self-transcending dynamic in it that it is capable of constantly going higher and higher and higher. And the better you get at reframing, the more you're naturally going to see things in terms of ideals and bonds. And that's a huge gain, I think, for anyone to have in life, that they can now see challenges in the lights of ideals and bonds.
Hey, this is Sharif here with another episode of The Golden Hour, joined by Dr. Kevin Majeres. Kevin, great to be here with you again.
Hey, Sharif, great to be back.
So, Kevin, we're going to do this episode on reframing. And in particular, it's a question we get from time to time, especially with people who are new to OptimalWork's ideas, is on the limits of reframing. Can every challenge be reframed? So I thought we could just start here with a question that someone has left for us.
Sounds good.
And then maybe at some point we'll want it for some new listeners, maybe explain exactly what reframing is. But let's start with the question. So this person says, I completely accept the theory that every challenge can be reframed. However, in my actual lived experience, it seems that I occasionally have challenges that seem impossible to reframe. What strategies are there for when a challenge is very difficult to reframe? Mm-hmm. Okay, Kevin, this is a pretty tough question. So,
yeah, I love it. So my first thing to try to do with the tough question is to agree with it and say, yes, reframing can sometimes be impossible. And then to ask, well, okay, so what we're talking about with reframing is it's the skill whereby a person is able to widen the context in which they view a challenge so that they can discover within it an opportunity for growth, for learning, for practice, somehow a way for the challenge to bring out the best in them. And so I think that it's good that we discover what makes reframing impossible sometimes. Because let's just say, yeah, it could be impossible to reframe. So now, do I think that's because of an inherent limitation in reframing? No. But that might still be the fact that for a given person, it's actually impossible for them to reframe. So if, like, for instance, say someone has spent their entire life just aiming for a certain kind of status, let's say like having a certain amount of money in the bank. And then they made a risky move in their stock portfolio and they end up losing everything. Like when the Silicon Bank goes up. So then now they've lost everything. And not to make light of that, which is very, traumatic for the people who have to go through that and whose companies are ruined. But the idea is then, how could you reframe that? If your entire life was about building your bank account and now it's not there, I would say, yes, that's impossible to reframe. Because reframing means widening the context. And if a person makes a refusal to widen the context or simply doesn't have a wider context available to them, they're not going to be able to reframe. And I say that is the essential thing for that person to discover. Why is it impossible for me to reframe this right now? What can I do about it so that how can I come up with a new view of this situation? But I don't know. Those are the interesting questions, I think.
Yeah. So your point is that if they're not willing to widen the context because their context is just solely this outcome that they want to achieve, and everything that happens in their life is oriented towards that outcome, then they're deliberately refusing to widen the context, and that's exactly what reframing is widening the context.
So it's either that they're refusing to because this is. And you could say maybe another thing is they just can't conceive of a wider context. And so reframing doesn't give any of us a particular set of beliefs. So it doesn't have that content. It's just a skill. And so reframing is a process. It doesn't then mean that there are certain things that if you believe in reframing, you have to believe. Reframing is simply a skill whereby you widen the context in which you're viewing a present challenge until you see an opportunity for growth in it. So that means it's really a test then of a person's worldview. Does the person's worldview have a wider context here? So it could be that their entire worldview money is all that matters, or status is all that matters, or having this job is all that matters. Like if your entire goal was to be like, say, like a governor of a state, and then you get thrown in prison. And so now you can't, you're out of your job as governor, which has happened. So, and you can't, now you will never be governor again. Well, you're going to need to discover a wider context if you're going to be able to reframe this. So sometimes the very need for reframing points the way to growth. The growth actually has to be in the worldview that the person has.
That's so how much in your kind of clinical practice and experience are you working with people on the worldview question? Because that it almost seems like somehow not appropriate or something, that you should just accept people's worldviews and then you're just teaching them psychological skills. But I guess what you're pointing out is that these psychological skills that you teach people are limited in their power, their effectiveness in some way by the person's worldview. So do you find it common that you need to work with people to develop a worldview? And then how do you go about doing that?
Yeah. So for most people, their worldview comes from their faith. And it should be considered off limits, I think, for a psychiatrist to be like trying to supply faith for people. Because, if I had a family member going to a psychiatrist, I don't think I would want the psychiatrist trying to, give that person the same faith that they have. So it does seem like because there's an imbalance in authority in a situation, that you actually have to live a lot of modesty with regard to your own beliefs. I think that that's a legitimate kind of way of respecting other people's dignity. That so you can't become the source of, that in a sense that your role there as a psychiatrist is different than the role of someone that they would go to get advice for, on matters of faith. Now, that said, I'm certainly cognizant of the fact that a lot of the people that come to see me have some kind of faith, and they do have a pretty rich worldview that could potentially allow them to reframe everything. So when you ask people direct questions like, in this, do you think that money is the most important thing in life? They say, oh, no, not really. Or is academic success really the only thing that matters? What else might matter here? Everyone, in my experience, in fact, does have a richer worldview. So I've never really felt the need to be teaching people about my beliefs about eternity. It's usually with what people have to work with, what they bring to me. They have a lot of very beautiful ideals already in their mind. They know what they would like their lives to be like. They can imagine what a loving relationship would look like and what bringing out their best would look like. So there's already, people have. I'm not sure I would say that they inherently have these things, but certainly the people I meet, they already have them. All of that kind of content that they need to really do the work of contextualizing challenge as something positive. So what happens more often is that people just aren't accessing the positivity that they already have at hand. And so I don't need to get totally into the worldview questions. Sometimes where it does come up, though, is when you're dealing with questions of death. So, and as a psychiatrist that specializes in anxiety disorders, there are people who have a fear of death. And so it does happen that you have to ask questions then about what do you believe happens after death? Essentially, can you see any way that death could bring out your best? What would it look like for death to bring out your best? What would thriving in that moment look like? To help get their mind over their fear of death. So in those cases, you were asking about their beliefs, essentially, but in a very respectful way. And it's not like I'm going to come swooping in and then say, here's what I think you should believe.
So you're just trying to explore their own worldview, not necessarily change it, just to bring it out, to make it actually operative in their lives and the practical experiences that they're having.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I remember this one resident that was in my program, which is when I was in residency, and he was talking to someone who he was trying to use like a CBT approach, which was like, well, then how bad would that be? And the person thought, well, this would mean, like this would be like an uncaring thing for me to do, toward my children. And he's like, well, so how bad would that be? And you're like, well, then I guess that would mean that I would like be a bad mother. He's like, well, then how bad would that be? Well, then I would die as a bad mother. He's like, well, how bad would that be? And they're like, well, I'd be in hell forever. And he said, oh, I guess that would be pretty bad. And he's like, I'm sorry, I don't know what to. That's like, you never want to be like trivializing people's beliefs by like, how bad would that be? So to me, that was a misunderstanding of how do you help people with this? In fact, the person wouldn't have consciously thought they were doing something so bad that it was worthy of this thing that they were, that they were fearing. So I just find that like, even people are scrupulous. You don't have to try to change their worldview at all. That you can work with it to show them what a better form of thriving would look like. So I just found that no matter what the challenge, I have never needed to tinker with worldviews. I think the real thing is like people generally believe like in a world that somehow does allow them to reframe challenges, in ways that can bring out their best. They're just not operating there yet. So it's like somehow the worldview is there as a notion, but it's not there as a real operative belief yet. And so many times it's like, it's a very great thing for people to rediscover then their faith, that in fact, they find these deeper meanings in life and the kind of person that they most want to be. They connect with that in a much deeper way then. So but not just having the notion, but having the reality.
So you think that's what this question is pointing at, that this person who accepts reframing in theory, I accept it's possible to reframe any situation. But when it comes to the reality of my lived experience, I find it difficult to reframe. So there's this question of,
yes,
in theory, notionally, yes, I accept it, but really, I can't do it.
And it's true also then, if you look at any given challenge, that you have to really see how this is good for you. I think another thing that can happen is that people just will say words in their head like, oh, okay, this is good for me, bring it on. And they will think that somehow saying the words is the act of reframing, because they think, well, the idea is correct. Like, isn't it enough that I just remind myself of this idea that this is an opportunity? So they just say in their head, okay, this is an opportunity, bring it on. Well, that may not be real. So to be real, I think you actually have to let yourself think through the scenario, the challenge that you're fearing, until you actually see how it is good for you. It can't be something forced. It has to be a real intellectual discovery of a wider context. So if the person who's afraid of losing money and then in fact loses it all, you could ask, well, then is there a way that this is giving you the opportunity that you most needed to grow? Usually when people see how to reframe something, not only do they see that they can reframe it, but they see that this was actually necessary for them, that this is something that's very good for them, that the challenge they're facing is somehow precisely the right challenge for them to be facing right now. And like their life has been leading up to this moment of getting them ready to really face this challenge in a healthy way. So it's interesting that normally when people really can see the reframe, they can actually see that this, in fact, is the perfect challenge for them right now. So I think which most people somehow, if they were to reason it through in their worldview, probably most people would come to that same conclusion. That somehow we are facing the right challenge for us right now.
Yeah. Now, Kevin, I think one thing we do a lot of is mentoring, working with other people. And given this idea that the reframe has to be real, I think one thing I can fall into is when I'm helping someone reframe a challenge is it's very conceptual for me. So it's not
Yeah.
because I'm not the one facing the challenge. They are. So I can kind of talk about it in some way, but had what's the role for say a mentor, someone giving advice, or a psychiatrist, psychologist,
Yeah.
therapist, of internalizing in some way the other person's challenge? Maybe you'd call that empathy, to kind of in some way make it more real for you, so that you're helping them to really embrace it as opposed to just embracing it notionally.
Yeah. So I think this is where a kind of Socratic questioning is most helpful, that you don't want to short circuit the power of the reframe by doing it for
Mm-hmm.
the person. So you're trying to help them exercise this skill of discovering the wider context, discovering the opportunity for growth. And so sometimes the main thing that you can do then as an outsider is help them keep working at it until you feel that somehow the feeling of it has changed now for both of you. Like you can feel the difference. And now they can, in fact, get to the point of saying the more the better. So that, yeah, when you really reframe something, you can see, in fact, the more the better. This is exactly what I need. So bring it on. I can welcome this. So you can help people, I think, one, by just like asking the questions to help them, but you don't want to do it for them. I think this is it's true that if someone's going through something painful, they can probably find a way of seeing a spiritual opportunity in the pain.
Mm-hmm.
But just to kind of, I don't know, just to tell them, come on, just offer it up.
Uh-huh.
Well, that's really dismissive and unrespectful of someone. So if you just get told by someone to do that, that would actually be kind of harsh, I think. Because so we don't want to be invalidating of how hard something is, and I think when people are trying to help others to reframe, the biggest danger is that you would be invalidating. And sometimes when people just hear us talk about reframing, it could feel potentially invalidating. Because aren't you minimizing how evil something is, how bad something is, by saying that they can grow from it? And so I think that's true. We don't want to be minimizing badness, but then again, we shouldn't shut out the possibility that good can somehow come from this.
Great. Kevin, I wanted to finish with one last question about reframing. It seems like sometimes reframing can tap into some of these deeper elements of our worldview, whereas sometimes it doesn't need to. So we often give the example of reframing adrenaline, that if we have a negative frame on adrenaline, we experience it as anxiety. But if we have a positive frame, then we can experience it as excitement, enthusiasm, even flow. So it's like we've reframed the adrenaline. We've been able to flip it from anxiety to enthusiasm. But at the same time, that's not really tapping into this element, this deep worldview and the ultimate questions of life, say. So I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on how reframe, different types of reframing, different occasions in which we might reframe, and how that relates to these deeper questions of what a person's worldview is.
Well, I think there is something inherent in reframing that is ordered toward magnanimity, towards the ability for us to transcend ourselves. So, and magnanimity has these different directions. Now, in some sense, you could say that, if a person had a negative view of adrenaline and its impact on their test-taking abilities, and then you help them to transcend that view, that narrow view of adrenaline is bad, into something that is richer and more varied and nuanced, that adrenaline has this potential to really boost your performance. Okay, well, that's already a kind of widening the context, right? And allowing the person to at least expand their view of adrenaline, and now expanding their view of what they can do. So then it's like the ceiling is raised on how could they do on this test? And that is very much like helping people to see that they're abilities are not fixed, that they can grow with practice. And so there is something about reframing that does lead people to a growth mindset. And that growth mindset means you're always then looking for what is the way then, the best way for me to grow in this. And as an individual, what that means is reframing means finding the ideals that help you to put challenges in a wider context. Ideals are patterns of responding to challenge, that are a kind of excellence in your character. And these I find to be very intact in people. That if you ask them the question, like if you imagine the person that you're closest to talking about you to someone who's never met you and they're bragging about how well you treat them, what would it make you happiest to hear them say? Boy, I've asked that question so many times to people, and the answers are always great. The answers are always in some way beautiful. So people are talking then about qualities like being understanding and attentive and forgiving and loving and kind. Well, all of these are really beautiful qualities that allow a person to stretch themselves in the face of challenge towards something positive. So that's a kind of magnanimity. But ultimately, we usually talk about magnanimity as what allows us to look past our own growth even, and to look at growing closer to someone and deepening our bond with that person. So it's really ultimately about bonds, which are developed by sincerely seeking the good of the other and forgetting about oneself and being generous and giving your best to the other person, in the bond. So it seems to me that reframing has this inherent kind of self-transcending dynamic in it that, it is capable of constantly going higher and higher and higher. And the better you get at reframing, the more you're naturally going to see things in terms of ideals and bonds. And that's a huge gain, I think, for anyone to have in life, that they can now see challenges in the lights of ideals and bonds.
So you're progressively widening the context, ultimately getting past your own kind of interest or your own satisfaction to then take into account others.
Yeah. And so it ends up being that it only gets more and more meaningful. So the proper use of adrenaline is excitement. Okay, there's some meaning in that, and it does open up the door. But then there's so much more in ideals, particularly ideals live in the context of your closest bonds. It just gets more and more immediately to like, what is the most meaningful thing in life? And that's what you want reframing to do, to help people to reconnect with meaning, to take these things from being notionally meaningful to now it's really meaningful. Now it's really connected to my challenges, and my ideals become my strength.
Well, Kevin, I think we've gotten to the point where we're now talking about the most meaningful thing in life. So I think that's a great high note for us to end on.
Yeah, it's great. Time for us to, that's a good place to stop. Thanks, Sharif.
Yeah, awesome. Great. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Until next time.